A piano key can remain silent for years, until it is pressed and decides how the song ends. Laura Mercer had always believed that the most dangerous silences were the ones nobody named. Not the comfortable kind, the silence of a Sunday morning with coffee cooling on the counter, or the quiet that settles between two people who have nothing left to prove to each other. Those silences were earned. The one she had been living inside for the past several months was something different. It sat at the dinner table without being invited. It rode in the passenger seat on drives she had once looked forward to. It occupied the space in the bed between her and Daniel every night, and neither of them reached across to acknowledge it was there. She told herself it was nothing. A season. The kind of distance that settles over a marriage when two people are running a business together, and the pressure of that starts pressing on everything else. She told herself that so many times that it had stopped feeling like a lie and started feeling like weather, something to endure, not examine. The company had belonged to her family for 3 generations. Her grandmother, Eleanor Whitmore, had founded it in a time when a woman running a manufacturing floor was the kind of thing people stared at and whispered about. Eleanor hadn't cared about the staring. She cared about the pianos. She built the factory on the belief that an instrument made with patience and precision would outlast every doubt anyone had about the hands that made it. 70 years later, the factory still stood, and still carried the family name, now hyphenated after Laura married Daniel and added his name to the sign, a gesture she had made freely, out of love, without a moment's hesitation. Laura had inherited the company at 31, 2 years before she met Daniel. Her mother had stepped away from it, not out of resentment, but because she simply loved other things more, and Eleanor had respected that choice with a grace Laura had always admired. So it came to Laura, and Laura, to her own quiet surprise, found that she didn't just accept the inheritance, she loved it. She loved the smell of fresh lacquer in the morning. She loved the particular sound the factory floor made when every station was running at full speed. A low, organized hum she had memorized before she was old enough for school. She loved that she could walk through that building and touch something her grandmother had touched and feel, without needing to explain it to anyone, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She met Daniel at a charity concert, 14 months before they married. He had been standing slightly apart from the main crowd, jacket unbuttoned, watching the stage with the kind of stillness that suggested he was actually listening. She had crossed the room without planning to, and said something about the pianist's left hand, and he had laughed. A real laugh, unpolished and immediate, and said he had been thinking the exact same thing. They talked for 3 hours. She drove home alone and thought about him the entire way. The wedding was small and honest, immediate family, close friends, a backyard in October, Daniel in a dark navy suit with his tie slightly crooked. She fixed it for him at the altar, and the guests laughed. And that was the precise moment she decided she was going to love him for the rest of her life. He joined the company gradually, which was how she had always imagined it would work. He started with the things she genuinely didn't enjoy: vendor negotiations, distribution logistics, the administrative machinery that kept everything moving but didn't require the feel for the product that Laura had grown up with. He was good at it, better than good. He had a way of walking into a negotiation and making the other side feel like they were getting exactly what they wanted, while he quietly secured everything he had come for. She admired that. She told him so, and she meant it every time. Over the first few years, his role expanded in ways that felt natural at the time. Laura stayed focused on the creative side of the business. New designs, a partnership with a music conservatory 2 states away, an apprenticeship program for young craftsmen that her grandmother would have loved. Daniel managed the financials, the supplier relationships, the day-to-day operational decisions that kept the floor running. It made practical sense to formalize his position. The founding documents required her personal presence at every direct supplier negotiation, and giving Daniel a formal ownership stake, 25% of the company, meant he could represent the business in those meetings without her needing to be there in person. It was a business decision as much as anything else, made clearly and deliberately. And at the time it had felt like the obvious thing to do. Raymond Ellison, the family's accountant, drew up the paperwork himself, just as he had drawn up nearly every important document the company had produced over the past 4 decades. Raymond had known Laura since she was 6 years old. He had attended her parents' anniversary dinners. He kept a photograph of her grandmother on the wall of his office next to portraits of his own family, and he had never once taken it down. It was at a company dinner, an evening organized to celebrate a new export contract with an overseas distributor, that Daniel stood with his glass raised and made the comment some of the older employees still remembered years later. He was relaxed that night, easy and warm in the way he could be when things were going well. And he looked out across the tables with a wide smile and said, half joking and half something else entirely, that he supposed part of the company was his now too. The senior staff laughed. Laura smiled and raised her own glass. She filed the comment away without examining it too carefully. The way you file away something that doesn't quite fit anywhere, but doesn't seem important enough to pursue. She would think about that night quite a lot in the months ahead. The change in Daniel was not sudden. That was what she kept returning to later, when she was trying to understand how she had missed it for as long as she had. It didn't arrive with a single dramatic shift she could point to and say, "There, that was the moment." It arrived the way winter does, so gradually that you keep dressing for fall until one morning the cold is simply undeniable. The meetings he started holding without her were occasional at first, then regular, then routine. The business trips that once lasted 2 or 3 days began stretching to 5, sometimes 6, with explanations that answered the surface of the question without really addressing what was underneath it. The way he spoke to her had shifted, not cruelly, not in any way she could have described to someone else without sounding like she was reaching for something that wasn't quite there, but the warmth had been replaced by something functional. He spoke to her the way you speak to a colleague you respect, but don't particularly think about when they're not in the room. She noticed. Of course she noticed. She was not a woman who missed things, but she also knew that naming something makes it real, and she was not ready for it to be real. So she chose, again and again, the more comfortable explanation. He was tired. The business was demanding. This was what long marriages sometimes looked like from the inside. She held on to that the way you hold on to a coat that no longer fits quite right, because it's familiar, and because the alternative means admitting that something important has changed and you don't yet know what to do about it. The call from Raymond came on a Tuesday morning in March, while she was still at the kitchen counter with her second cup of coffee. Raymond's name on her screen was not unusual. He called every few weeks with something routine. But his voice, when she answered, carried a note she recognized immediately. Raymond Ellison had been practicing calm for 67 years and was exceptionally good at it. The slight stiffness in his greeting told her something was off before he had explained a single thing. He needed an invoice, a specific one tied to a supplier payment from the previous quarter, required to close out the month's accounting. He had asked Daniel for it. He mentioned this carefully, with no particular emphasis, nearly 4 weeks ago. He had followed up twice. He was not calling to complain, he said, in the precise tone of a man who absolutely was. He simply needed the document by 1 o'clock that afternoon, or the filing would have to be delayed, and that delay would create a cascade of other problems he preferred not to enumerate. Laura apologized on Daniel's behalf, a reflex so practiced she barely registered doing it, and told Raymond she would have it to him before noon. When she hung up, she stood very still for a moment, her coffee cold in her hand, and let herself notice, briefly, that she had just apologized for her husband to a man who had known her since childhood, and that it was not the first time in recent months that she had done exactly that. She called Daniel. It went to voicemail. She called again 10 minutes later. Voicemail. She sent a message, short and factual, just the name of the document and the 1 o'clock deadline, and watched the screen for a response that didn't come. By 11 in the morning, she had tried 4 times. The silence on the other end had begun to feel like something other than a missed call. She made the decision the way she made most decisions, quietly, without spending more time deliberating than the situation required. She would go to the factory, find the invoice in Daniel's filing system, send it to Raymond before the deadline, and be back home before the afternoon. A simple problem with a simple solution. She told herself that firmly as she picked up her keys. The drive took 18 minutes. She parked beside the main entrance, said good morning to Priya, the young woman at the front desk who always smiled like she meant it, and went directly to the administrative wing. Daniel's office was on the 2nd floor, at the end of a corridor lined with framed photographs of pianos the factory had produced across the decades. Her grandmother's first model was in the frame nearest the stairs, an old photograph, gone slightly amber at the edges, the piano itself looking almost modest next to what the factory produced now. Laura paused in front of it for exactly 2 seconds, for a reason she couldn't have explained, and then continued to the door. She worked through the filing cabinet methodically, reading tabs, pulling folders, returning the ones that didn't match. The office smelled faintly of cedar from the pencil cup on Daniel's desk, a cup she had bought during their first year of marriage at a small craft fair, because the wood had reminded her of the factory floor. She had not thought about that cup in years. She looked at it now and felt something move through her chest that she couldn't immediately name. She found the invoice in the 3rd drawer. She set it aside and was about to close the drawer when a folder caught her eye. Newer than the ones around it, its tab printed rather than handwritten, positioned slightly forward as if placed in a hurry, and never pushed all the way back. She pulled it out without consciously deciding to. She would not be able to explain afterward exactly why. Instinct, maybe, or something quieter than instinct. She opened it. The document inside was a revised operating agreement for Whitmore and Mercer. She recognized the format immediately. Raymond had drafted the original, and she had signed dozens of amendments over the years. She found her name in the 2nd paragraph and began to read, the words arriving in pieces that then assembled themselves all at once into something she was not prepared for. The amendment recorded a transfer of ownership. Her shares, the full 100% of her stake in the company her grandmother had built, transferred to Daniel Mercer, effective 60 days prior, executed by proxy. The signature line beneath her name did not carry her signature. It carried the notation, by power of attorney, followed by a reference number she had never seen before. She read it twice, then a 3rd time. The paper did not change. She was still holding it when her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Daniel. She stood there for 3 full seconds, the document trembling very slightly in her left hand. And then she answered. Her voice, when it came, was even and warm and entirely automatic. "Hey, honey," she said. His voice came through with the flat, distant quality it had carried for months. He asked where she was. She explained. Raymond, the invoice, the deadline, The morning of unanswered calls. There was a pause on his end, brief but there, and then he told her to leave it, that he was on his way in, that he would handle it himself. She told him not to worry, that she had already found what she came for and was heading out. She asked if he'd be home for dinner. His voice relaxed. She could hear it, the easing of something he had been bracing for, something he now believed, apparently, he did not need to brace for after all. He said no. He'd be late again. She told him that was fine. She said she loved him. The line went quiet a beat before she realized he had already ended the call. She lowered the phone. She folded the document with deliberate, steady hands, the same careful way she had watched her grandmother fold important papers, and placed it inside her bag, beneath the invoice for Raymond. Then she looked at the cedar cup one more time, picked up her bag, and walked out of the office, pulling the door shut behind her with a soft, final click. On her way through the production floor toward the exit, she passed the finishing area, where a technician was running a standard sound check on a piano that had just been completed. It was part of the daily process, unremarkable, repeated without ceremony in that building every single day. The technician played a slow passage in a minor key, working through the lower register, listening for anything off. The notes traveled up through the high ceiling of the factory and settled over everything in the room. Laura stopped walking. She stood there for a moment she could not measure, her bag over her shoulder, and the document folded inside it. And she did not move again until the last note faded into the air and the room returned to silence. Then she walked out into the parking lot, got into her car, and sat with her hands in her lap for a long time without starting the engine. She sent the invoice to Raymond from the parking lot. She typed the email carefully, attached the file, checked the address twice, and pressed send. It was 12:47 in the afternoon. She had 13 minutes to spare. Raymond would have what he needed. The filing would be completed on time, and the small practical crisis that had started the morning would be resolved without incident. She sat with the phone in her lap after the screen went dark, and thought about how strange it was that she had just handled something so ordinary in the middle of something so enormous, and how the ordinary thing had gone exactly as planned, while the enormous thing was still sitting in her bag, folded in thirds, waiting. She did not cry in the parking lot. She had expected to, had braced for it, the way you brace for a wave you can see building, but it didn't come. What came instead was a kind of cold clarity, the particular stillness of a mind that has received information too large to process all at once, and has decided, without consulting the rest of the body, to simply hold it for now. Her hands were steady on the steering wheel when she finally started the car. She drove home at a careful, measured speed, both hands at 10 and 2, stopping fully at every stop sign the way she hadn't since she'd first gotten her license at 16. The house was quiet when she walked in. She put her bag down on the kitchen counter, not tossing it, setting it down, with the same deliberate steadiness she'd used to fold the document, and stood for a moment in the kitchen that she and Daniel had renovated 4 years into their marriage. They'd argued pleasantly about the countertops. She had wanted the lighter marble. He'd pushed for something darker and more dramatic, and she had let him win because it genuinely hadn't mattered enough to her at the time, and because she had loved the way he lit up when he got to make a decision about something that delighted him. She looked at the dark countertops now. She made herself eat something small, crackers and cheese, standing at the counter, which was not how she usually ate lunch, but was the best she could manage. Then she went to the small office off the hallway, where the desktop computer sat on a desk she'd had since graduate school. The computer was shared. Both hers and Daniel's files lived on it, accessible remotely from anywhere. A system they'd set up 3 years ago when the business started requiring both of them to work from home more regularly. She sat down, entered the password she'd been using for 2 years, and waited. The screen returned an error. She typed it again, slower, making sure of each character. Incorrect password. She sat back in the chair. The password to their shared home computer had never been changed without discussion. In 10 years of marriage, they had updated it twice. Once when they upgraded the system, and once when a technician had come to service it, and they'd agreed, almost simultaneously and without much conversation, that it was sensible to change it afterward. Both times, the new password had been something they chose together, something she knew as naturally as her own name. She stared at the error message on the screen for a long time without moving, and something she had been carefully keeping at a distance all afternoon moved one step closer. She closed the browser and went to sit in the living room. She did not turn on the television. She picked up a book she had been reading in pieces for the past 6 weeks, a novel about a woman restoring a house in the south of France, and held it open on her lap without reading a single word. She sat there until the light through the front windows turned orange, and then gray, and then disappeared entirely. Daniel came home at 11:37 that night. She knew the time because she had been lying in bed with her eyes closed and her phone face down on the nightstand. And she heard the garage door, heard his footsteps through the kitchen, heard the particular sound the refrigerator made when he opened it for exactly the length of time it took to get a glass of water. She heard him come down the hall. She kept her breathing slow and even. She felt the mattress shift when he sat on the edge to remove his shoes. He was in the bathroom for 9 minutes. When he came back and got into bed, he was on his side with his back to her, and within 20 minutes his breathing had settled into the rhythm of sleep. She lay beside him and looked at the ceiling. She was not angry yet. She understood, distantly, that the anger was there, and that it would arrive in full when the shock finished moving through her. But for now, what she felt was something older and quieter. Grief, maybe, or the space where grief was about to be. The 10 years of their marriage were moving through her mind not as a single block of time but as specific images, individual and clear, the way photographs scatter when you drop an album. His crooked tie at the altar, the sound of his laugh the first night they met, the cedar cup on his desk, the way he had once driven 2 hours in freezing rain because she'd called him from a work trip saying she didn't feel well and wanted to come home, and he had said he would come get her without hesitating for even a second, and she had told him it was completely unnecessary, and he had come anyway. She rolled onto her side. His phone was on the nightstand on his side of the bed, screen down, presumably locked. She thought about it for a moment. Then she rolled back and looked at the ceiling again. She fell asleep somewhere after 2 in the morning and woke at 6 when his alarm went off. She watched through barely open eyes as he silenced it, reached for his phone, looked at the screen for a moment with an expression she couldn't read from her angle, and set it face down again. He dressed quietly. He had always been considerate about that, dressing in the low light without turning on the overhead. And he left without waking her, or without trying to wake her. She wasn't sure anymore which one it was, or whether it had ever been the first one. Over the next 3 days, she functioned. That was the word she kept returning to. Not lived, not moved through, but functioned, in the mechanical and competent way of someone who knows the steps to something and performs them without needing to feel them. She answered emails. She had 2 calls with the conservatory partnership, both of which went smoothly, because she was good at her work regardless of what was happening in the rest of her life, and she had always known the difference between the 2. She cooked dinner both nights Daniel was home, and they ate together in a way that would have looked, from the outside, like a quiet Tuesday married couple with a lot on their minds. He complimented the food once. She thanked him. The silence between them expanded and contracted like something breathing. On the third night, he came to bed earlier than he had in weeks. She was already there, on her side with the lamp still on, her book open to the same page it had been on for over a month. He came in from the bathroom and set his phone on the nightstand, and she registered it without reacting. Face down, as always, as it had been every night since she'd started paying attention. He got into bed. They exchanged the small domestic words that still passed between them. She mentioned that the plumber needed to come about the kitchen faucet. He said he'd call in the morning. She said good night. He said good night. And then the lamp went off. She waited. It was harder than she expected. Not because she was afraid of what she might find, but because some part of her was still, even now, hoping for a way out. Some version of this where the document had a reasonable explanation, where the computer password had been changed for a reason she'd simply forgotten, where the distance in his eyes was something she had magnified through the particular distortion of her own fear. She had built a life with this person. She had handed him a key to every room she had, including rooms she hadn't known were there until she found herself sharing them with him. And some part of her was still standing in the hallway of that life, unwilling to accept that the key had been used to take something rather than to belong somewhere. His breathing slowed, deepened. He shifted once, settling into the pillow, and then was still. She didn't move immediately. She waited another full 10 minutes, counting slowly in her mind, precise and patient, the way the factory floor had taught her to be about processes that couldn't be rushed. When she was certain, she turned very slowly toward his side of the bed. The room was dark, but not black. A narrow band of light came under the bedroom door from the hallway nightlight, and her eyes had long since adjusted. She could see the shape of his phone on the nightstand. She reached across and touched the screen. It lit up. She moved her fingers before it could lock again, and the screen stayed open. He had not yet reset the timer. It was still set to the longer interval he'd kept since they'd bought the phones together 2 years ago, back when neither of them had felt any reason to make things harder to reach. The messages were in a thread near the top. The name was Natalie. She read. She didn't read quickly, the way you skim something you're afraid of. She read slowly and carefully, the way she read contracts, the way her grandmother had taught her to read anything that mattered, fully and without flinching. The messages went back 7 months. They were not, and she registered this with a precision that surprised her, that she would think about later. They were not what she had imagined finding. There were no photographs, no descriptions of meetings, no hotel names, nothing physically explicit. What they were was something she found, in its own way, harder to look at. They were intimate in the way of two people who have decided to know each other. Daily, specific, the kind of conversation that requires full attention and extended trust. Daniel telling Natalie about his day. Daniel asking about hers. Daniel writing, in one message from 4 months ago, that he had been waiting his whole life to feel the way he felt when they talked, and that he needed to be patient because he was taking steps to make sure that when they were finally together, it would be real, and it would be permanent. He had written, in a message 2 months after that he wasn't the kind of man who would do things dishonestly, that he was handling it the right way, that she deserved someone who came to her cleanly, without loose ends, that she just needed to trust him a little longer. Laura set the phone back on the nightstand, face down, exactly as it had been. She lay back on her pillow and looked at the ceiling. Beside her, Daniel slept, without knowing that anything had changed. She thought about the word honestly, the way he had used it, the architecture of the logic he had apparently constructed, the belief that what he was doing was a kind of integrity, that because there had been no physical betrayal, he was managing the situation with a dignity it did not possess. She had always known Daniel to be intelligent. She understood, lying there in the dark beside him, that intelligence and self-awareness are not the same thing, and that a person can be genuinely, sincerely convinced of a story they have written entirely themselves. She also understood something else. She had two things now, the document in her bag and the conversation on his phone, and she needed to understand exactly what the document meant before she decided what to do with either of them. The altered operating agreement, the proxy signature, the power of attorney reference number she had never seen before. These were not things she could evaluate alone. There was exactly one person she trusted to explain them to her clearly and without softening anything. Raymond Ellison, who had drafted the original documents and who had known the Whitmore family longer than she had been alive. She would call him in the morning. She would be careful, and she would be methodical, and she would not make a single move until she understood the full picture. That was what her grandmother would have done. Eleanor Whitmore had built 70 years of a business on the principle that you did not act on what you felt until you understood what was true, and that understanding what was true took longer than most people were willing to wait. Laura was willing to wait. She had been waiting for months, though she hadn't known it until now. What she felt in that moment was something that surprised her. Not the devastation she had braced for, but something below it. Something more fundamental and, in its own way, more dangerous. It felt like ground returning under her feet after a long time of standing on something that shifted. It felt like clarity. It felt like the particular calm of a woman who has decided what she is going to do, who has not yet done it, and who is no longer afraid. She closed her eyes. Across the room, the faintest outline of morning was beginning to appear behind the curtains. The sky not yet light, but no longer entirely dark. She listened to the silence of the house around her, and somewhere beneath the silence, she could almost hear it. The low, steady hum of a factory floor at the start of a new day. She called Raymond at 8:15 the following morning, standing at the kitchen counter with a cup of coffee she hadn't yet touched. She had rehearsed, very briefly, what she was going to say. But when he answered, and she heard the familiar steadiness of his voice, she didn't use any of it. She simply told him she needed to see him in person, that it was about the company, and that she would prefer not to explain further over the phone. There was a pause, short, attentive, and Raymond said he could be at his office by 9:30. He did not ask her anything else. He had known her long enough to understand that when Laura Whitmore used that particular tone, the right thing to do was to make space and wait. She arrived at 9:22. Raymond's office was in a low brick building 2 miles from the factory. He had occupied the same suite for over 30 years, and the interior reflected that continuity without apology. Dark wood furniture, shelves of binders organized by year and client, a coffee maker that was always on and always produced something stronger than necessary. On the wall behind his desk hung 3 photographs, one of his wife and their 2 daughters at a family reunion, one of a fishing trip with men whose faces Laura half recognized from old company dinners, and one of Eleanor Whitmore standing in front of the factory on the day the original sign was installed. Eleanor was not smiling in the photograph. She was looking at the camera with the expression of a woman who has just finished something difficult and is already thinking about what comes next. Raymond was at his desk when his assistant showed her in. He stood, as he always did, and came around the desk to greet her the way he had greeted her since she was a child. Both hands, brief and warm, a handshake that was also something slightly closer. He looked at her face, and then looked again, more carefully, in the way of a person who reads people with the same patience he applied to columns of figures. "Sit down, Laura," he said quietly. She sat. She opened her bag and removed the document, still folded in thirds the way she had folded it in Daniel's office 2 days ago. She placed it on the desk in front of him without speaking. He picked it up. He unfolded it with the methodical care of someone who has handled important papers his entire professional life, and understands that the way you treat a document reflects the seriousness with which you intend to read it. His eyes moved across the page in the slow, systematic way she recognized from years of watching him work, left to right, top to bottom, pausing at specific lines the way a musician pauses at a difficult measure. He read it twice. Then he set it flat on the desk, smoothed it once with the back of his hand, and looked at her. "Where did you find this?" he asked. She told him. All of it. The call from him about the invoice, the morning of unanswered attempts to reach Daniel, the drive to the factory, the filing cabinet, the folder slightly out of place. She told it in the same order it had happened, without embellishment and without leaving anything significant out. Raymond listened the way he always listened, with his hands folded on the desk and his full attention on her face, not interrupting once. When she finished, the office was quiet enough that she could hear the coffee maker doing something in the corner. Raymond picked up the document again and turned to the second page. He pointed to the power of attorney reference number in the lower section, the number she hadn't recognized when she'd first read it, and set it beside her on the desk. "This references a proxy authorization from 11 years ago," he said. "I remember it because I drafted it myself at your request, shortly after you and Daniel were married. You gave him authority to represent Whitmore and Mercer in direct supplier negotiations, specific negotiations with a defined scope. The language was intentional and limited. It authorized him to sign purchasing agreements and renewal contracts with approved vendors. Nothing outside that." He paused, making sure she was following. "A transfer of ownership shares is not a purchasing agreement," he continued. "It is not a vendor contract. It is not remotely within the scope of that authorization. Whoever used this proxy to validate the amendment either did not read the original document carefully enough to understand its limits, or read it and decided to proceed anyway, counting on no one else reading it closely either." Laura looked at the document on the desk between them. "Is it valid?" she asked. "Legally?" "No," Raymond said, without hesitation, and without dressing it in anything softer. "Any competent attorney will tell you the same thing. The proxy was used for a purpose it was never authorized to serve. The amendment cannot stand. Your ownership of the company was never legally transferred." She nodded slowly. She had known, somewhere below the shock and the sleepless nights, that this was what he would say. Hearing it spoken aloud in Raymond's careful, certain voice was something different from knowing it. It made the shape of the thing real, in a way that her own internal certainty hadn't quite managed. "There's something else," Raymond said. He had not moved from where he sat. His hands were still folded on the desk, and his voice had shifted slightly, not in its steadiness, but in the weight behind it, the way a person sounds when they are about to say something they have been carrying for a long time. "I need to tell you something I should have mentioned when it was drafted, and didn't. Because at the time it seemed like a precaution that would never be necessary, and I didn't want to put language around a marriage that was just starting." Laura looked at him. "When Daniel took formal ownership of the 25%, Raymond said, your father asked me to include a protective clause in the amended agreement. He asked me the week before we finalized the paperwork. He didn't explain his reasons in detail. Your father rarely explained things in detail when he felt the outcome was self-evident. But the clause was clear. In the event of a dissolution of marriage, for any reason, the ownership stake transferred to Daniel would revert in full to you. The room was very quiet. He never knew about it, Raymond said. Daniel. The clause is embedded in the body of the agreement, in language that reads, unless you're looking for it specifically, like a standard succession provision. He signed the document. I have the original here, with his signature on every initialed page. Raymond paused. In my experience, people who feel certain about the terms of an agreement rarely read the full document with care. They read the parts that confirm what they already believe and stop there. Laura sat with that for a long moment. She thought about all the times Daniel had moved through the business with the easy confidence of a man who knew the shape of his own territory. She thought about the export dinner, his glass raised, his smile wide. Part of this company is mine now. She thought about the message on his phone, the one where he'd written that he was handling things the right way, that he wasn't the kind of man who did things dishonestly. He doesn't know the clause exists, she said. It was not quite a question. There is no reason he would, Raymond said, unless he had read the full agreement with the specific intention of finding every provision, which, he glanced at the fraudulent amendment on his desk. I think we can conclude he did not. Laura looked at the photograph of her grandmother on the wall. Eleanor stood in front of the factory sign with her characteristic expression, already thinking about what came next. Laura had spent her whole life finding that expression difficult to read. She understood it completely now. She left Raymond's office 40 minutes later with a copy of the original operating agreement and a handwritten note of the clause's exact location within it, in Raymond's precise and slightly old-fashioned cursive. She sat in her car and read the clause twice. The exact language, the legal terms she understood well enough. The sentence that her father had quietly placed inside a document a decade ago and never mentioned to her. The way you leave something behind for someone without wanting to make it into a larger thing than it is. She thought about her father. He had been a man of particular silences, not cold ones, but deliberate ones, the silences of someone who observed more than he spoke and saved his words for the moments when they would do the most good. He had met Daniel 3 times before the wedding and had been warm to him, measured and genuine the way he was with everyone. He had never said anything to Laura that suggested he had reservations, but he had called Raymond the week before the paperwork was finalized and asked for a clause, and then he had said nothing about it. Not to Daniel, not to Laura, not to anyone, as far as she knew. He had just made sure it was there, the way you make sure the lock on a door works properly, without announcing that you've checked it. She sat with her hands in her lap and let herself feel, for the first time since Tuesday morning, something that was not grief or shock, or the cold clarity she had been using to hold herself upright. What she felt now was something warmer and more complicated. A love for her father that she had never stopped feeling, but that arrived in this moment with a specific and unexpected force, because he had known something she hadn't and had protected her with it, without ever making her feel like she needed protecting. She drove home. Over the next several days, she moved through the house and the business and the daily structure of her life with Daniel in a way that required more precision than anything she had done before. She could not afford to let him know what she had found. Not yet. She needed to speak to an attorney before any next step, and she needed to do that without Daniel becoming aware that the situation had changed. She kept her voice warm at the dinner table. She answered his brief morning conversations with the same measured tone she had been using for months, long enough that the shift in her, if there was one, would not register against it. She was careful. She was patient. She thought, more than once, about Eleanor's photograph on Raymond's wall. the expression of a woman who had already planned the next 3 moves. The attorney she consulted was a woman named Patricia Halford, recommended to her by a friend who had gone through a business dispute 2 years earlier and described Patricia as someone who asked questions you wished you'd thought of yourself. They met on a Thursday afternoon at Patricia's office downtown, and Laura arrived with the fraudulent amendment, the original operating agreement with Raymond's handwritten note marking the protective clause, and a summary she had written herself. 1 page, clean and factual, of the sequence of events from the morning she had found the document to the night she had read Daniel's phone. Patricia read everything without speaking. She was a compact, deliberate woman in her mid-50s with very short gray hair and the manner of someone who does not waste motion. When she finished, she set the papers down and looked at Laura the way Raymond had. Carefully, with the kind of attention that wasn't personal, but felt like it. The fraudulent amendment is straightforward from a legal standpoint, Patricia said. The proxy authorization cannot support this use. We can have it voided. That's not the complex part. She tapped the original operating agreement, open to the page Raymond had marked. The protective clause is the part that changes everything else. He will walk into divorce proceedings, if it comes to that, believing he is entitled to 25% of the company. He will negotiate from that position. He will make decisions based on it. And at the moment the clause is presented, all of that collapses. Laura said nothing. My question for you, Patricia said, is what outcome you are trying to achieve. Not what you're entitled to. That part I can map out clearly. But what you actually want at the end of this. Laura had thought about that question before Patricia asked it. She had been thinking about it in various forms since Tuesday morning in the factory parking lot. She thought about the cedar cup on Daniel's desk. She thought about the October wedding and the crooked tie. She thought about the message on his phone, "I'm handling it the right way," and about the document in the filing cabinet. Her name on a transfer she had never authorized. Her grandmother's company handed over on paper by a proxy that had no right to do it. I want the company, Laura said, whole, the way it's always been. I want my name to be the only name on it. Patricia nodded as though this was the answer she had expected. And him? Patricia asked. Laura considered the question for a moment, not because the answer was uncertain, but because she wanted to say it accurately. I want him to understand what he actually had, she said, before he decided it wasn't enough. Patricia looked at her for a moment longer. Then she clicked her pen open and began writing. Outside the office window, the afternoon light was starting to lean toward gold, the particular angle it reached in late spring when the days were stretching longer, and the city looked, briefly, more generous than it usually did. Laura watched it for a moment over Patricia's shoulder. She thought about the factory floor at the end of a full day. The machines quiet, the lights low, the smell of wood and lacquer settling into the silence. And she thought about a piano being played in a minor key, filling a high ceiling with something that sounded almost like a question waiting for its answer. She turned back to Patricia and answered the next question, and the one after that, and she did not look out the window again. Patricia filed the initial paperwork on a Monday morning in early April, 3 weeks after their first meeting. Laura was at the factory when it happened, not by accident, but by choice. She had decided, early on, that she did not want to be sitting at home waiting for her phone to move when the process began. She wanted to be somewhere that belonged to her, doing work that was hers, and so she spent that Monday morning in the finishing room going over quality checks on a new series of upright models her team had been developing for 6 months. She ran her hand along the side of a nearly completed cabinet, checking the lacquer with her fingertips, the way the craftsman had taught her years ago, and she thought about nothing else but the wood under her hand and the work in front of her. It was the most present she had felt in months. Daniel received the notification at 2:17 in the afternoon. She knew the time because Patricia called her at 2:43 to confirm it had been served, and mentioned that his attorney, a man named Greg Solis, whom Patricia described in the neutral, precisely worded way of someone who has encountered a person before and formed a clear opinion, had already been in contact. Daniel had, apparently, not wasted any time. She drove home that evening with a steadiness she had not expected to feel. She had imagined this part of it many times over the past weeks. The moment Daniel knew, the confrontation that would follow, the shape that it might take. And in her imagination, it had always felt large and sharp-edged, a thing to brace against. What she found when she walked through the door was something different. Daniel was in the kitchen, standing at the counter with his jacket still on, his phone on the surface in front of him. He looked up when she came in. His expression was not what she had anticipated. It was not the expression of a man caught. It was the expression of a man who has just been handed an inconvenience he intends to manage efficiently. "I assume we can skip the part where you explain what you were thinking," he said. "We can skip whatever you'd like," she said. She set her bag down. She went to the refrigerator and poured herself a glass of water and drank half of it standing at the sink. He watched her do it with the particular look she had seen him use in negotiations. Patient, calculating, not yet ready to show his position. "I'm going to assume," he said, "that this is emotional. That you found something in the office and made a set of conclusions that seem to justify this." He paused. "We can talk about it like adults. We don't need lawyers involved yet." "The lawyers are already involved," she said. She set the glass down on the counter. "That's what being served means." Something moved across his face. Not quite irritation. Something more controlled than that. The adjustment of a person recalibrating the opening moves of a situation they had already, in their own mind, mapped out. "Laura, whatever you found, the company matter is something I can explain. There were administrative reasons for the amendment. Reasons that made sense at the time, and that I was going to walk you through when the timing was right." She looked at him. She thought about saying a number of things. She chose the one that was truest. "I know what the document says, Daniel. I've had it reviewed. By Raymond." His tone landed just slightly on the far side of neutral. "Raymond, who has been the Whitmore family's man for 40 years, and is hardly what I'd call an objective source." "By an attorney," she said. "Raymond confirmed what I already suspected. The attorney confirmed the rest." He was quiet for a moment. She could see him thinking, not panicking, not yet, but reassessing. He set his phone in his jacket pocket. He straightened slightly. "The 25% is mine," he said. "That was a legitimate transfer. You gave me that stake because it made sense for the business, and it still makes sense. Whatever else you think is happening here, that part is solid. We'll let the process determine that," she said. The conversation ended there, not with a door slamming, not with raised voices. It simply reached the point where both of them understood that the words available in that kitchen on that evening were not sufficient for what was actually happening between them, and they stopped. He slept in the guest room that night. She lay in their bed. Her bed, she thought, in the careful and deliberate way she had begun to reclaim the language around the things that were hers. And she listened to the house settle around her and felt something she could only describe as a kind of grief moving through and out, making space for something that had not yet arrived. The following weeks arranged themselves into a structure she had not experienced before, but adapted to with the same methodical attention she brought to everything that required it. There were calls with Patricia, document reviews, exchanges through attorneys that translated the wreckage of a decade into formal language with numbered clauses. She continued going to the factory every day. This was not a gesture. It was simply true that the work needed doing, and that she was the one who had always done it, and that being at the factory was, for her, less an escape from what was happening than a reminder of what had always been real, regardless of what else changed around it. The staff knew, in the way that people who work in a close environment always know, that something significant had shifted. Nobody said anything directly to her. Priya at the front desk smiled a little more carefully. The production manager, a quiet and competent man named Walt, who had been with the company for 19 years, started leaving his daily reports on her desk, rather than routing them through the administrative wing the way he had done for the past several years. She noticed these small adjustments and felt something warm and uncomplicated in them. Loyalty expressed in the only way it could be at a distance, with a tact that cost something. She did not contact Natalie. She had thought about it. There were nights in the first week when the idea had been present and close, but she came back, every time, to the same conclusion. Natalie was not the source of the problem. She was the direction Daniel had chosen to aim himself in, but the problem had been growing long before it found that particular shape. Contacting her would satisfy nothing except the part of Laura that wanted someone to be clearly at fault in a way that could be addressed directly, and she had never been particularly good at letting that part of herself make decisions. Daniel moved out on the 12th of April, a Saturday, 19 days after the papers were served. He did it with the same efficiency he brought to everything logistical. He arranged a moving service. He took the things that were his. He left nothing that could start an argument about ownership. He took the dark countertop bar stools she had always disliked. He left the cedar cup. She noticed the cup's absence from her mind for 3 full days before she realized she had not thought about it. And then she moved it from the desk in the office to the small shelf in the kitchen, where she kept the things she valued quietly. The legal process moved forward with a deliberate pace that Patricia had prepared her for. Daniel, through Greg Solis, was consistent and confident on one point above all others. The 25% was his, earned through nearly a decade of active management and formalized through a legitimate ownership transfer. He did not contest the divorce itself. He did not dispute the division of the personal assets, the house, the accounts, the practical architecture of a shared life taken apart item by item. What he held firm on, with a certainty that never wavered across any of the exchanges Patricia relayed to Laura, was the stake in the company. He spoke about it the way a person speaks about something that is simply, obviously, factually true. Not something to negotiate, but something to acknowledge. Patricia, each time she relayed this, kept her expression exactly neutral. Laura kept hers the same way. They had discussed, at length and with great care, the question of when to present the protective clause. The fraudulent amendment had already been challenged through proper channels and was in the process of being formally voided. That proceeding was separate, handled by a different attorney Patricia had recommended, and was moving forward on its own track. The clause was a different matter. It existed within the original legitimate operating agreement, the document Daniel had signed, and it would become relevant at the moment the divorce settlement reached the question of company ownership. Patricia's advice had been to hold it, not to announce it, not to reference it in the preliminary exchanges, not to give Greg Solis any opportunity to prepare for it or construct an argument around it in advance. Let Daniel come to the table certain. Let him negotiate from a position he believed was solid ground. He'll bring it up himself, Patricia had said at their last meeting before the settlement session was scheduled. He's been consistent about it from the first exchange. He believes it, completely and without reservation. Let him say it one more time, in the room, with the documents in front of him. Laura had nodded. She understood the logic perfectly. She also understood, and had understood since the night she lay in the dark beside him listening to him sleep, that this was not about strategy for its own sake. It was about something she could not quite name, but that felt, when she examined it honestly, like a form of accuracy. She wanted the truth of the situation to be complete before it was spoken. She wanted there to be no version of events in which Daniel could later tell himself he had been tricked or ambushed or denied the chance to make a different choice. She wanted him to have said, fully and clearly and on the record, exactly what he believed was his, and then to have the document explain, in language that admitted no interpretation, what had always actually been true. The settlement session was scheduled for a Thursday morning in May. Patricia's conference room was on the 14th floor of a building downtown, with a window that looked north across the city. Laura arrived 11 minutes early. She wore the same kind of thing she wore to important meetings at the factory. Well cut, quiet, nothing that would read as trying too hard in either direction. She brought a single folder. Inside it was the original operating agreement, open to the page Raymond had marked, and the copy of Raymond's handwritten note identifying the clause. She placed the folder on the table in front of her and set her hands on top of it and waited. Daniel arrived exactly on time, Greg Solis a half step behind him. He was dressed well. He had always dressed well for situations he intended to win, and he came into the room with the ease of a man who had decided the terms of a meeting before walking into it. He looked at Laura when he sat down across from her and gave her a nod that was neither warm nor hostile, the nod of a business counterpart whose relationship with her had been reorganized into something transactional, and therefore more manageable. She returned it at the same temperature. The session moved through its structured stages with the procedural rhythm that Patricia had outlined for her. The house, the accounts, the personal property already divided. Each item confirmed, each agreement noted. Daniel's attorney was thorough and precise. Patricia was the same. Laura and Daniel were the 2 points around which the whole thing turned, and they did their part, responding when addressed, confirming what was already settled, moving the process forward with the cooperative efficiency of 2 people who have decided that the fastest path through something difficult is to stay on the path. And then the company came up. Greg Solis placed a summary sheet on the table. He walked through Daniel's position in the same careful language he had used in every prior exchange. The formalized transfer, the years of active management, the contribution to the business's growth, the 25% that Daniel had held as a documented stakeholder for nearly 8 years. He spoke for 4 minutes without interruption. At no point did his argument waver or soften. At no point did Daniel's expression suggest that any of this felt uncertain. When Greg finished, Daniel looked across the table at Laura. And then he did the thing she had, without quite admitting it to herself, been waiting for him to do since the process began. He spoke directly, without routing it through his attorney, in the voice she had once found so compelling, certain, unhurried, carrying in it the weight of a man who believed completely in what he was saying. "Part of this company is mine," he said. "That's not a position. That's a fact. Whatever else has happened between us, that part doesn't change." Patricia had a pen in her hand. She set it down. The room was quiet. Laura looked at Daniel across the table and felt, in that moment, not the anger that had come and gone in waves over the past weeks, not the grief that had moved through her and mostly out, but something else, something she recognized, with a slight start, as the particular sadness of watching a person be completely wrong about something they are completely sure of. He believed it. That was the thing. He had built the belief with such care over such a long time that it had become indistinguishable from fact inside the structure of his own mind. He had wanted the company badly enough that he had constructed a version of events in which having it was reasonable and right. And he had lived inside that version long enough that it felt like history rather than invention. She looked at him for one more moment. Then she opened the folder in front of her and removed the operating agreement, turned to the marked page, and slid it across the table. "I know you believe that," she said. "I'd like you to read the paragraph Raymond Ellison highlighted, starting at line 14. Greg Solis leaned forward. Daniel looked at the page. In the window behind him, the city stretched north in the late morning light, the buildings clear and still, and the room was very quiet while he read. The silence in that room had a texture to it, not the silence of an empty space, but the silence of a place where several people are present, and one of them has stopped breathing quite normally. Daniel read the paragraph. Laura watched him read it. She did not watch his face for the reaction. She watched his eyes, the movement of them across the lines of text, the particular stillness that came over them when a person reaches the sentence that changes the meaning of everything that came before it. She had read that paragraph enough times by now that she could have recited it from memory, and she had imagined, in various versions, what it would look like when he read it for the first time. She had not imagined it looking quite like this. She had expected something louder, an objection, a challenge, the immediate reach toward his attorney. What she saw instead was something quieter and, in its own way, more complete. He read it once, and then he read it again, and the certainty she had watched him carry into the room with such ease did not leave him in a single moment. It left him the way light leaves a room when the sun moves behind a cloud, gradually, and then all at once. And then the room is simply different than it was. Greg Solis had been reading over his client's shoulder. He straightened now and looked at Patricia with the careful expression of a man reassessing the geometry of a room he thought he had already mapped. "We'll need time to review this provision in full," he said. His voice was professionally steady, which was, Laura thought, a considerable achievement under the circumstances. "Of course," Patricia said. She was equally steady, which cost her nothing because she had known this moment was coming for weeks. Daniel set the document down. He did not push it back across the table. He left it in front of him, open to the marked page, as though he might need to read it a third time, or as though he was not yet ready to stop looking at it. He looked up at Laura. The expression on his face was one she had never seen there before. Not in 10 years of a life shared at close range, not in the best moments or the hardest ones. It was the expression of a man who has just understood that the story he has been telling himself, the one he refined and defended and built his next chapter around, had a structural error at its foundation that made every floor above it unreliable. It was not guilt she was seeing, not yet. It was something prior to guilt, the moment before a person can name what they have done, because they are still absorbing the fact that what they believed was simply, cleanly, irreversibly untrue. She did not look away from him. She did not say anything else. She had said what needed to be said, and the document had done the rest, and there was nothing remaining in this room that required her to add to it. The session concluded with the procedural formalities that Patricia had prepared her for, the agreement to adjourn for review, the scheduling of a follow-up, the signatures on the items already settled. Daniel signed where he was asked to sign. His attorney spoke for him in the exchanges that followed. Daniel himself said very little. When they stood to leave, and the room began to reorganize itself into the ordinary movements of people gathering their things and preparing to go their separate ways, Daniel paused on his side of the table. He looked at Laura one more time. She met his eyes and held them, steady and calm, not cold but not warm, something in between. The look of a woman who has already grieved what needed grieving and is standing, now, on the other side of it. He opened his mouth as though he intended to say something. Then he closed it. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair, and he walked out of the conference room, and Greg Solis followed him, and the door swung shut behind them with the soft finality of a well-made thing working exactly as it was designed to. Patricia set her pen down and looked at Laura across the table. "That," she said, with the measured satisfaction of someone who does not overstate things, "is how that goes." Laura exhaled. It was the first full breath she had taken since she walked into the room. The weeks that followed had their own particular quality. Not easy, because the undoing of a decade is never easy regardless of how necessary it is, but honest in a way that the months before them had not been. There were more sessions, more documents, more of the careful procedural language that translated the end of a marriage into something the legal world could process and file and eventually close. The protective clause held exactly as Raymond had written it, exactly as Patricia had argued it would. The fraudulent amendment was formally voided through the separate proceeding, which concluded without drama and with a finding that required no further interpretation. The proxy had been used far outside its authorized scope. The transfer it purported to execute had no legal standing, and the ownership of Whitmore and Mercer had never, at any point, changed hands. The company had always been hers. The paper that said otherwise had been, from the moment it was signed, nothing more than paper. Daniel did not contest the clause. There was, his attorney quietly acknowledged in the final exchange, no viable ground on which to contest it. He had signed the original operating agreement himself, initialed every page, and the clause was there in plain language for anyone who read the full document with the intention of understanding what they were agreeing to. He had not done that. He had read the parts that confirmed what he already believed and stopped there, exactly as Raymond had said. And so, the 25%, the steak he had toasted at a company dinner, the holding he had mentioned in messages to Natalie as the foundation of a future he was building toward, reverted to Laura on the date the divorce was finalized, without ceremony and without appeal, the way a thing returns to its rightful place when the temporary arrangement that displaced it is recognized for what it was. She was at the factory the morning the final documents arrived. Patricia sent them by secure courier, and they reached Laura at her desk in the administrative wing, her grandmother's old desk, which she had moved back into the main office 3 weeks after Daniel left, because it had been in storage long enough, and it belonged where it could be seen. She signed where she was needed. She dated everything in full, the way she always did. She called Raymond, who answered on the second ring, and she told him it was done. He was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line, the specific quiet of a man who has been holding something carefully for a long time and is only now setting it down. "Your father would be very proud of you," Raymond said. He said it simply, and without any additional decoration, the way he said the things he meant most. She thanked him. She held the phone for a moment after they hung up, and then she set it on the desk and looked at the window. The factory was fully alive around her. She could feel it the way she had always been able to feel it. Not just hear it, but feel it. The specific frequency of a building doing what it was built to do. Every station running. Every hand at work. She had been at that desk for 2 hours and had already had 3 conversations with the production team about a redesign on the new Upright series, a decision she had been wanting to make for months and had now made, clearly, and without needing to route it through anyone else's opinion. It was a small thing, a design choice, a change to a cabinet profile that would affect the line's visual identity, and, she believed, appeal to a younger market without losing the craftsman quality the Whitmore name had always carried. It was also not a small thing at all, and she knew that, and she thought about it now as she looked at the window. She had been running this company in one way or another since she was 31 years old. She had inherited it from her mother, who had inherited it from Eleanor, who had built it with her own hands in a time when the hands of women were not always trusted to build things that were meant to last. She had loved it across all the years she had run it, including the years she had shared the running of it, because her love for the factory was not contingent on the circumstances around it. But there was something different now in the way she sat at her grandmother's desk and felt the building move around her. Something that had no clean name, not relief exactly, not triumph, not the particular satisfaction of winning something she had fought for, though it contained all of those things. It was more fundamental than any of them. It was the feeling of a space that had briefly held the shape of another person's presence returning, slowly and completely, to its own shape. The feeling of a thing becoming, again, purely what it was. She thought about Natalie only once more, on an afternoon in late May when she was leaving the factory and passed a woman on the sidewalk outside with a similar walk. A particular way of moving, quick and purposeful. And the association arrived and passed without leaving much behind it. She did not wish Natalie harm. She did not wish her well either, with any warmth. She simply understood, as she had understood from the beginning, that Natalie occupied a place in the story that was real, but not central. The center had always been here, the building behind her, the name above the door, the 3 generations of women who had stood in one version or another of this same spot, and known, with a certainty that required no argument, that this was theirs. The afternoon Raymond came to deliver the final clean copy of the operating agreement, signed, notarized, reflecting nothing but the truth of what had always been the case. Laura asked him to stay for a few minutes. They walked together through the production floor, the way she had walked it with her father when she was young, the way her father had walked it with Eleanor before that. Raymond moved slowly and looked at everything with the careful attention of someone who understands that the value of a thing is not always visible in the summary, but is always present in the detail. He paused at the finishing area, where a technician was running a sound check on a concert grand that had just completed its final stage before delivery. The technician played a slow, full chord in a major key, rich and open, the kind of sound that fills a space completely, and then keeps filling it even after the note has technically ended. Raymond stood beside her and listened to it resolve. "Your grandmother used to say," he said after a moment, "that you can always tell when a piano is properly finished, not by looking at it, by the way the first full note sounds in a room." He paused. "She said a well-made instrument doesn't hide anything. Every flaw shows up in the sound sooner or later." Laura looked at him. "That's why she was so particular," he said. "About everything. The materials, the process, the people. She used to say that the note doesn't lie." He glanced at her. "She would have said the same thing about the last year of your life, I think. In her particular way." Laura looked back at the piano. The technician moved through the upper register now, lighter and clearer, each note sitting cleanly in the air above the factory floor. Around them, the rest of the building continued its work. The low hum of machinery, the sound of wood being shaped and sanded and fitted, the measured rhythm of people doing skilled things with their hands and their full attention. She had grown up with this sound. She had fallen asleep to it as a child, when her father brought her in on late evenings, She had stood in this building on the day she learned her grandmother had died, and felt it continue moving around her grief as though to tell her, without words, that the thing Eleanor had built was larger than any single loss, and would outlast it. She stood there beside Raymond and listened to the piano, and felt, with a completeness she had not expected and could not entirely account for, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because everything had gone the way she would have chosen. None of what had happened in the past several months was something she would have chosen, not any of it, but because she had moved through it honestly and come out the other side still holding what mattered. The company, her grandmother's desk, Raymond's handwriting on a piece of paper, her father's quiet, foresighted love, the cedar cup on the kitchen shelf, herself. 3 weeks later, at the first all-staff meeting she held as the sole principal of Whitmore and Mercer, she stood at the front of the main floor with every employee gathered in the open space between the production stations and the finishing area. The same space where, years ago, a man had raised a glass and made a claim she had filed away without examining. She spoke briefly, the way her grandmother had always spoken, without excess, with complete attention to every person in the room. She told them that the company was entering a new phase, that there were projects she intended to revive and new directions she intended to pursue, beginning with an initiative her grandmother had started decades ago that had been set aside and that deserved, finally, to be finished. She thanked Walt, who nodded from the third row with the exact expression of a man who already knew everything she was saying and was glad to hear it said aloud. She thanked Priya, who smiled the way she always did. She looked at the faces around her, some she had known since childhood, some newer, all of them part of the thing her grandmother had made and that she was now, fully and without division, responsible for. When she finished, she walked back through the building to her office. She passed the area where the finished pianos waited before delivery, 3 of them standing in a row under the high windows, their cabinets dark and polished and still. She stopped for a moment and placed her hand flat on the side of the nearest one. The wood was cool and smooth under her palm. She could feel, very faintly, the quality of stillness that a piano has when it is complete, when every key has been tuned and every mechanism is in order, and the instrument is ready, fully and finally, to be played. She thought about the first sentence she had ever said about this year, if she had been the kind of woman who opened things with sentences. She thought about silence and what it holds, and what it is waiting for. She thought about a key that stays quiet for as long as it needs to, through everything that happens around it, through the weight of hands that press it for the wrong reasons and the long stretches when no one presses it at all, until the moment arrives, unhurried and certain, when it is touched in exactly the right way. And then it sounds, clear and full and completely itself, and the music, finally, can begin.